The next metric we'll take a look at is transaction count. So transaction count is simply the amount of transactions on a specific blockchain network over a period of time. This can be a good way to measure activity and usage on a network, as a blockchain with a higher transaction count will point towards more usage and more transactions, a higher or increasing in transaction count, I should say, compared to a blockchain with a lower or a decreasing transaction count. That suggests that there is less popularity and less usage over time. Right, we see this inverse correlation. Increasing transaction count suggests increasing usage and popularity. Decreasing transaction count suggests decreasing usage and popularity. Now, it should be noted that there is no way to confirm that the transaction count is not made up of smaller amounts of users inflating the on-chain transaction count on purpose, right? There's no way of saying, oh, that's the same person with 1,000 accounts and he or she's just moving, let's say, 0.002 Bitcoin back and forth over and over to inflate the blockchain transaction counts. And it's not something that's just regulated just to Bitcoin. This is really something that could be done on any altcoin. Who's to say Avalanche has more transactions than Solana if someone can just easily move X amount of either of the coins very easily. Both of them have low transaction fees, and you could just move. I'm just going to move 5 AVAX, 5 Avalanche back and forth to boost up the transaction count. If another person say, I'm going to move 5 Solana back and forth, there's nothing really stopping them from doing that. So that is something to consider. Now here is a reading. This is actually from Glassnode. This is Bitcoin, the number of transaction or the transaction count. In the gray line, we see the general price of Bitcoin over time. And the orange, we see the number of transactions over time. So as we can see, generally over time, the number of Bitcoin transaction has tremendously grown, indicating great general use with the blockchain, right? There is the early cycles, as we could see, 2011, Bitcoin reaching about $40 per coin from just being valued at just cents, tremendous growth, crashing back down to $2, right? And then once again, increasing in 2013 to $200, and then crashing back down to $40, then increasing back up to about $1,000, and then crashing back to $500, give or take, right? So there's this ongoing trend of cycles within Bitcoin, and this has just continued. Obviously, this pricing chart, as we can see on the y-axis here, it's not necessarily linear or a fixed value, right? It does tend to jump around a bit. But the main purpose of this is not necessarily, the focus is not necessarily on the price, it's really on the number of transactions and where this aligns with where Bitcoin was in terms of pricing. This general increase specifically here, I mean, this is just general usage, but particularly from 2015 onward, we see this first spike in transactions. 200,000 transactions, and this is really on a day, right? So this is an extreme amount, and just generally this trend from this point onward really has seen some explosive growth, where we reached an all-time high number of transactions nearing almost 500,000 in a very tight range, right, on this particular moment in this day. And there was an immediate crash in transactions, and this is something that really wasn't seen before. I mean, you could make the argument that crashing from 370 to a low of about 125,000 was noticeable, but this is an even greater crash or retracement in terms of transactions, and it does coincide with the 2017-2018 market cycle, where Bitcoin reached this top of about 19,000 and then fell back down. We do see the levels of transactions really bottomed out into mid and early 2018. coinciding with these two lows. And at the same time, Bitcoin would continue to fall, particularly going into 2019. We saw Bitcoin fall to about 4,000, or really just under 4,000. And at the same time, Bitcoin transactions begin to ramp up. Looking towards the more recent cycles, right? So 2020, 2021, these market tops observed. What's interesting here is that price has gone up, but the general direction of Bitcoin transactions has gone down, the general counts, right? We're reaching lower extreme highs or lower extreme peaks in terms of transaction count, and lower lows as well. So this is indicating that less people are moving their Bitcoin just in general, and which, since price is going up, it kind of suggests that there's a greater sense, and goes along with this theory, that there's a greater sense of people buying Bitcoin specifically to hold, not necessarily for a means of exchange, right? So there's other coins that arguably do payment systems and means of exchange better than Bitcoin, right? They have lower transaction fees, they have faster transaction times, and the payments are done near instantly. Whereas Bitcoin has this idea that is a new sense, where it's went from a medium of exchange or a payment coin and has sort of transitioned into the space where it's now a store of value rivaling gold, right? It has this notion that it's this inflation hedge, and it's a store of value, a digital gold, or a better version of gold based on its fundamental properties. So with that, we're seeing less people using it for transactions and more people generally holding it, as we can see with the general price increase. Going along with transaction and transaction counts, we have transaction value or transaction volume. So transaction value refers to how much capital has been transacted, which is sent and received within a period of time. This is different from transaction count, which refers to the actual number of transactions. Now we're starting to see, all right, are there differences between a transaction that moved 500,000 in Bitcoin or versus a transaction that moved $5 in Bitcoin, right? A 0.0003 Bitcoin, or moving whole Bitcoins at a time. We start to see that difference. Now, transaction value can be useful to see if the transaction count is manipulated. Are there transactions moving meaningful amounts of capital, or is it just large figures with very small amounts transacted? Meaningful amounts can be subjective, though. So this is something that we do want to consider. Are the transactions moved? Are they moving meaningful amounts of money? And remember, meaningful can be subjective. Are we considering a whole Bitcoin to be meaningful? Right now, Bitcoin's about 40,000. So that means the person's moving $40,000 at a time. Is half a Bitcoin meaningful, right? What is our criteria for determining what is a meaningful amount of capital? So that's really based on your settings, and it's subjective, right? Maybe we only want to look for Bitcoin transactions that are only moving $1,000 or more. So that's a fairly small amount of Bitcoin, right? So, it really depends on what your criteria is in terms of meaningful or what you're actually tracking. Now, transaction volume can be measured in terms of fiat, such as US dollar, or in the protocol's native unit. Now, for example, let's say there were 20 Ethereum transactions that were sent on the same day, and each of them was worth $100 each. We could say that the daily transaction volume was $2,000. Right, there were 20 transactions, and we've multiplied that by $100 per transaction. That's where we would get that daily transaction volume. So here's another example from Glassnode. This is the Bitcoin total transfer volume. We do see specific spikes in the total transfer volume. Really observe, for the most part, it's small amounts, right, in terms of Bitcoin. So the total transfer volume generally is low. We have seen high amounts of transfer volumes spike, and particularly 2012, and resulting from that, we do see an increase. 2016, we see an extreme spike, and resulting from that, we do see another increase, right? So Bitcoin was about maybe $100, and it reached a high of maybe about $300-400. So that is an increase. Here we see another noticeable spike. This is really where it comes into play. All right, I'm going to take a look at these on-chain analytics, and I want to see if there are any correlations with this to price. And this is where we can start to strategize. All right, this is happening on the on-chain, on the blockchain. How am I expecting price to react? So let's see, 2019, 2020. So right in the middle, we see around here, there was a spike, and generally there was a decrease, right? There was a general decrease in price. Particularly in this part, we're not going to count the coronavirus event in March 2020, because that's something that is really, that was a macro event and not something that you can necessarily account for when investing. Now, following that, we do see these general increases in 2021 and 2020, and there are large amounts of Bitcoin being transferred. It does indicate that. So we do have to see if there is any correlation between these large movements and actual price development. Next up, we're taking a look at a chart of total size of transactions. Here we see the general size of the transactions has greatly increased, right? So more and more Bitcoin is actually being sent, and this could be in terms of dollars, this could be in terms of just the Bitcoin itself. As we could see, more and more is being transacted. We have reached some sort of a point of stability, particularly from this high point in 2019 and let's say this low point in 2020, where generally it does seem like this particular area, this range of about 210 million to a low of maybe 100 million, this seems to be about the range that the total size of transactions on a daily perspective seems to have stayed within.